What if the $half sitting in your drawer right now is worth far more than 50 cents? Welcome back, and today we're diving into one of the most quietly fascinating coins in American collecting history, the Kennedy $half. Most people spent them without a second glance, but a handful of survivors from this exact series have stunned collectors at auction, and the difference between an ordinary example and an extraordinary one sometimes comes down to details so small you could miss them in seconds. Stay with us, because what you're about to discover might make you look at your loose change very differently. Step 1. The 1972 Kennedy $half is one of those coins that most people have passed through their fingers without a second glance, tossed into a jar, spent at a gas station, or forgotten at the bottom of a drawer for decades. And that casual dismissal is exactly what makes this particular date so quietly fascinating to the collectors who actually know what they're looking at. John F. Kennedy's portrait has graced the $half since 1964, introduced as a tribute just months after the assassination that shocked the entire nation. And by 1972, the series had settled into a rhythm that felt almost routine to the U.S. Mint. But routine production years are sometimes exactly where the most interesting stories hide. The 1972 issue was struck at 3 facilities: Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco, each leaving its own fingerprint on the coins it produced. Philadelphia coins carry no mint mark, Denver pieces bear a small D, and San Francisco struck proof versions with an S, those mirror-bright collector editions that were carefully packaged and sold directly to enthusiasts rather than released into circulation. What most people don't realize is that the sheer volume of coins produced that year, hundreds of millions across all facilities, created the exact conditions where small but significant variations could slip through quality control. And a handful of those variations have since become the quiet obsession of specialists who study this series with almost religious dedication. The design itself carries a weight of history that goes far beyond the metal it's stamped on. Gilroy Roberts, the chief engraver of the U.S. Mint, sculpted Kennedy's portrait for the obverse, drawing from the presidential medal that had been prepared shortly before Kennedy's death. And there's something almost haunting about knowing that the likeness was already in progress when tragedy struck. The reverse features a modified presidential coat of arms, designed by Frank Gasparo, who would later become chief engraver himself, and the eagle at the center holds both an olive branch and arrows in its talons, symbols of peace and strength that felt especially meaningful during the turbulent early 1970s, a period still shadowed by Vietnam, political upheaval, and a nation searching for its identity. The coin's composition in 1972 was clad, meaning it consists of a copper core sandwiched between layers of copper-nickel on the outer surfaces, a significant departure from the 40% silver versions struck between 1965 and 1970, and a detail that matters enormously when you're trying to figure out what you're actually holding. A genuine 1972 clad $half weighs approximately 11.34 grams, and that number becomes your first investigative tool, because coins that deviate noticeably from that weight in either direction immediately raise questions worth pursuing further. Now here's where the story starts to get genuinely interesting, because 1972 is not just another quiet year in the Kennedy $half series. It contains one of the most talked about mint eras in the entire modern coinage era. The 1972 Philadelphia double die obverse is a variety that has sent collectors into a near frenzy whenever a strong example surfaces, and the doubling on this coin is not the subtle, squint-and-maybe variety that requires a loop and a generous imagination. On the most dramatic examples, the doubling is visible on Kennedy's eye, on the lettering of Liberty and In God We Trust, and sometimes across multiple design elements simultaneously, creating an almost ghostly second impression that sits just slightly offset from the primary image. This happens when the working die used to strike the coin was itself created from a hub that impressed the design twice at slightly different angles or positions, essentially baking the error into the die before a single coin was ever struck, meaning that every coin produced from that particular die carries the same characteristic doubling. Which is why die variety collectors spend so much time cross-referencing reference books and comparison images trying to match what they're seeing under magnification to documented examples. Finding a strong 1972 DDO in circulated condition already puts you in interesting territory, but finding one that somehow survived in high mint state condition, with original luster intact and minimal contact marks, is the kind of discovery that makes a collector's hands shake just a little. Beyond the doubled die, there are other variations and anomalies worth understanding when you hold a 1972 Kennedy $half up to the light. Strike quality varied from coin to coin and from facility to facility, and sharply struck examples where Kennedy's hair detail above the ear is crisp and fully defined, where the eagle's breast feathers show clear separation, and where the rim stands tall and even all the way around the coin, are significantly more desirable than weakly struck pieces where those same details feel soft and indistinct. The mint mark itself, that small d or the absence of any mark on Philadelphia coins, can sometimes appear repunched or slightly doubled on its own, a separate but related type of variety that attentive collectors document and prize. Proof coins from San Francisco deserve their own moment of attention here, because the 1972 S-Proof is a beautifully executed piece with deeply mirrored fields that reflect like dark glass and frosted design elements that create the cameo contrast so eagerly sought by proof collectors. But even among proofs, condition matters enormously, and a proof that has been mishandled, cleaned, or stored improperly loses much of its appeal to serious buyers almost instantly. The lesson woven through all of this is that the exact same date and mint mark can represent wildly different things depending on the specific characteristics of the individual coin, which is why responsible examination is always the starting point rather than the conclusion. Let's talk about what these coins are actually worth in realistic terms, because this is where honest conversation matters more than optimism. A standard 1972 Kennedy $half in average circulated condition, the kind that shows wear on Kennedy's cheekbone and the high points of the eagle, is genuinely a common coin. And in that state, it's typically worth face value or just marginally above it to most buyers, perhaps 50 cents to $1 or $2 at best in most informal settings. That might feel anticlimactic, but stay with this, because the story changes dramatically the moment condition, variety, or rarity enters the picture. 1972 Philadelphia issue graded MS65 by a professional third-party grading service like PCGS or NGC, meaning it has original mint luster, exceptional strike, and virtually no distracting contact marks, has sold at auction for figures that would surprise anyone who assumed it was just a common coin. And when you introduce the doubled die variety into that same grading conversation, the numbers become genuinely compelling. Documented examples of the 1972 DDO in high mint state grades have attracted serious collector attention, with strong auction results reaching into the hundreds of dollars for mid-grade examples and potentially into the low thousands for the finest known specimens, though it's absolutely critical to understand that these values are estimates based on past performance and are never guaranteed to repeat. The coin market fluctuates, demand shifts. And what's sold yesterday for a strong price might find a different result in a different room on a different day. Picture a collector, let's call her Margaret, a retired schoolteacher from Ohio who spent 20 years casually setting aside Kennedy $half because she always thought they were beautiful coins that deserved better than a cash register. Margaret never considered herself a serious numismatist, but she had patience and a habit of looking closely, and one afternoon, while sorting through a small accumulation she'd built up over the years, she noticed something strange about a 1972 Philadelphia coin. The letters in Liberty looked thicker somehow, almost doubled, like the coin couldn't quite make up its mind where the letters were supposed to be. She sent it to a grading service almost as an afterthought, spending the submission fee with modest expectations, and when the certified holder came back with a designation confirming a doubled die variety and a respectable mint state grade, the appraisal that followed was significantly higher than anything she had anticipated. Stories like Margaret's are real in the collector world, not universal, not guaranteed, not a reliable investment strategy, but real enough that they remind us why careful examination of what you actually have is always worthwhile before making any assumptions. The emotional weight of that kind of discovery is hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. That strange intersection of history, luck, and patient attention that suddenly makes an ordinary afternoon feel extraordinary. So how do you begin examining your own 1972 Kennedy half-dollar responsibly? Start with weight. That 11.34-gram figure for the clad version is your baseline, and any coin that feels dramatically lighter or heavier than expected deserves a closer look, or at minimum, a conversation with someone who knows the series well. Color is your next clue. The clad composition gives these coins a distinctive silver and copper appearance at the edge, and if you look at the edge of the coin and see a solid silvery color with no visible copper layer, you might be looking at a different composition entirely, though this would be unusual and worth investigating carefully rather than assuming. Under a good loupe or even a quality magnifying glass, examine Kennedy's eye, the letters in Liberty and in God we trust, and the date itself for any signs of doubling, that slight ghosting or shadow that suggests the design was impressed more than once. Look at the rim and check that it's even and consistent, since coins with tilted dies can sometimes show uneven rim thickness that specialists note as worth documenting. And please, before drawing any conclusions about what something might be worth, invest in professional third-party authentication and grading, because the presence of a certified holder from a reputable service is what transforms a collector's claim into a buyer's confidence, and it protects you just as much as it protects any future transaction. What makes this entire conversation so persistently compelling is the simple fact that 1972 Kennedy half-dollars are still out there in the world, sitting in estate boxes, tucked into coin folders bought at yard sales, rattling around in the back of dresser drawers in houses that haven't been thoroughly sorted in 40 years. The coins that eventually surface as significant examples rarely announce themselves dramatically. They wait quietly, indistinguishable to the casual eye from the thousands of ordinary examples surrounding them, until someone with a loupe and a little knowledge decides to look more carefully than everyone else did before them. That possibility, not a guarantee, never a guarantee, but a genuine possibility, is what keeps collectors returning to this hobby with the same energy decade after decade. And if a coin as seemingly common as the 1972 Kennedy half-dollar can carry within it the potential for a double die discovery that changes the entire conversation about its value, then consider what might be waiting in the next coin we're going to examine together. A piece with an even stranger history, an even more dramatic minting story, and variations that specialists have spent years arguing about in heated forum threads and auction preview rooms. A coin that looks entirely ordinary until you know exactly what you're supposed to be searching for. Step 2. The 1973 D. Kennedy half-dollar is one of those coins that sits at a curious crossroads between abundance and obscurity, minted in enormous numbers at the Denver facility, yet carrying within its design and production history a depth of detail that most people who handled it never paused to appreciate. Denver was running at full capacity during this period, and the half-dollar denomination had already completed its transition away from silver entirely, settling into the copper-nickel clad composition that defined the series from 1971 onward, a change that felt almost institutional by 1973, as if the mint had quietly closed a door on the precious metal era and moved forward without ceremony. The small D mint mark, stamped just below Kennedy's portrait on the obverse, serves as the Denver facility's signature, a tiny letter carrying enormous meaning for variety collectors who understand that different facilities produced coins with subtly different characteristics even when working from the same master design. What's remarkable about the 1973 D specifically is that its story doesn't begin with rarity in the traditional sense. It begins instead with volume, with the sheer industrial momentum of a mint responding to circulation demand, and with the quiet reality that within that volume, small but meaningful differences were sometimes pressed permanently into metal without anyone in the production chain ever noticing. The portrait of John F. Kennedy on this coin carries a gravity that never quite fades regardless of how many times you've seen it, because Gilroy Roberts' original sculpting captured something genuinely presidential about the man: the slight upward tilt of the chin, the careful rendering of the hair above the temple, the composed dignity of a profile that was already being transformed into national mythology when this design was first rushed into production in early 1964. By 1973, the design had been in circulation for nearly a decade, but the working dies were still being produced from hubs that preserved Roberts' original artistic intentions, and on well-struck 1973D examples, the detail in Kennedy's hair above the ear and along the jawline remains impressively defined. Frank Gasparo's reverse, featuring the heraldic eagle with spread wings, the shield at its breast, and the olive branch and arrows held in opposing talons, rewards close examination in a way that casual handling never allows: the feather separation on the eagle's wings, the precision of the lettering in United States of America and $half arching around the periphery, and the placement of the 13 stars above the eagle's head all reflect a design tradition that was rooted in generations of American coinage philosophy. These aren't decorative choices made lightly. They're symbols assembled with deliberate meaning, and recognizing that intentionality changes how you look at even a well-worn example sitting in your palm. Denver's production of the 1973 $half ran into the tens of millions, and that number creates an interesting paradox that experienced collectors understand intuitively. High mintage coins are often paradoxically scarce in high grades precisely because their abundance made individual preservation seem unnecessary at the time. Nobody set aside rolls of 1973D $half thinking they were protecting something rare, which means that genuinely pristine examples that survived the decades without cleaning, without mishandling, and without the kind of casual contact damage that accumulates when coins are stored loosely together are actually harder to locate than the raw production numbers might suggest. The copper-nickel-clad composition of these coins, while durable in circulation, develops a particular kind of surface sensitivity in uncirculated specimens that collectors refer to when discussing bag marks, those small, flat abrasions caused by coins striking each other during counting, bagging, and transport at the mint itself, before the coin ever reached a single human hand. A 1973D $half that somehow emerged from the production and distribution process without accumulating these contact marks, with its original mint luster still flowing across the surfaces in the cartwheel pattern that rotates under a light source, represents a genuinely superior example of its type. And that superiority is exactly what professional grading services are trained to identify and certify with the kind of precision that transforms collector confidence into market value. Mint mark placement and strike characteristics are the details that separate a passing glance from a genuine investigation, and on the 1973D, both deserve patient attention. The D mint mark on Kennedy $half of this era was hand-punched into working dies individually rather than incorporated at the master hub stage, a production method that introduces the possibility of repunched mint marks, where the punch was applied more than once at a slightly different angle or position, leaving a secondary impression that's visible under magnification. Repunched mint mark varieties on coins of this period have been documented across multiple denominations and dates, and while not every 1973D will show this characteristic, the possibility makes examining the mint mark under quality loop a worthwhile first step in any serious evaluation. Beyond the mint mark, strike quality on Denver $half of this vintage could vary depending on die wear, press pressure, and where in the die's production lifespan a particular coin was struck. Early die state coins tend to show the sharpest detail, while late die state examples might display a softer, slightly mushy quality to the fine details, particularly in Kennedy's hair and in the eagle's feather work, that signals heavy use of the die before it was retired. The conversation about weight and composition becomes particularly important with 1973 D half dollars when you consider the off-metal error possibilities that occasionally emerge from coins of this era. A standard clad half dollar weighs 11.34 grams, and that specification was meant to be consistent, but mechanical errors in the planchet production process could occasionally introduce blanks of the wrong metal or wrong thickness into the coin press before anyone caught the mistake. Coins struck on wrong planchets, on dime planchets, on quarter planchets, or on planchets intended for foreign coin production that happened to be running through nearby facilities represent some of the most dramatic and valuable mint errors in American numismatics. And while they're genuinely rare, their existence is documented well enough that dismissing the possibility without checking would be a missed opportunity. Holding a 1973 D half dollar and noting that it feels lighter than expected, or that the color at the edge doesn't show the expected copper core between the outer nickel layers, or that the proportions seem somehow slightly off compared to a known example, any of these observations should prompt further investigation rather than a quick dismissal. The difference between a common coin and an extraordinary one sometimes lives entirely in the weight registered on a precise digital scale and the color observed at the coin's edge under good lighting. Realistic value discussion around the 1973 D Kennedy half dollar requires honesty paired with genuine appreciation for what the collector market actually rewards. In circulated grades showing clear wear across Kennedy's cheekbone and the high relief areas of the reverse eagle, this coin is genuinely common, and most examples in that condition trade for modest amounts that reflect their abundance, often close to face value in casual settings, perhaps slightly above in organized collector markets. But condition is where this story pivots dramatically, and a 1973 D that has been professionally graded by PCGS or NGC at the MS65 level or higher, representing a coin with exceptional original luster, strong strike, and minimal surface disturbances, occupies an entirely different position in the marketplace than its mintage numbers might suggest. Certified examples in the finest known grades for this date and mint have attracted prices that would genuinely surprise anyone who assumed the coin had no collector potential, with strong specimens in top-tier mint state grades, occasionally drawing hundreds of dollars from registry set collectors and specialists who are actively competing to own the finest certified example of each date in the Kennedy series. These values are never guaranteed and always depend on current market demand, the preferences of buyers present at a given auction, and the specific certification details on each individual coin, but they represent real transactions documented in auction archives, not theoretical figures invented to create excitement. When a verified mint error enters this conversation, the entire value framework shifts again into territory that demands even more careful qualification. A 1973 D half dollar confirmed by professional authentication to have been struck on a wrong planchet, or displaying a dramatic double die on the obverse, with clear separation visible on Kennedy's features and the surrounding lettering, or showing a significant die cap or brockage error. These are coins that move into collector categories where four-figure discussions become genuinely plausible, with the most dramatic and well-documented examples occasionally reaching into higher ranges in competitive auction environments. The critical qualifier woven through every sentence of that statement is professional authentication, because the collector market for error coins and varieties is sophisticated enough that unverified claims about unusual characteristics carry almost no weight with serious buyers. An error coin in a certified holder from a reputable grading service, accompanied by documentation of its specific characteristics and anomalies, is a fundamentally different object than the same coin sitting raw in a cardboard holder with someone's handwritten note about what makes it special. And understanding that difference is the most practically useful thing anyone new to this field can internalize before making any buying or selling decisions. Examining a 1973 D Kennedy half dollar properly means slowing down in a way that modern life rarely encourages, bringing genuine patience and the right tools to an object that rewards both. Begin with the edge, looking for that layered copper-nickel structure that confirms the correct clad composition, and note the color and evenness of the edge reading, those fine parallel lines that run around the circumference and should appear sharp and consistent on well-struck examples. Move to the weight, using a digital scale calibrated to tenths of a gram if possible, and compare the result to the 11.34 gram standard before drawing any conclusions about what you have. Under magnification, trace the D-mint mark carefully for any signs of doubling or repunching, then move to Kennedy's portrait and examine the lettering in Liberty and In God We Trust for any ghost impressions or slight offsets that might indicate a doubled die. Study the rim for evenness and height, because tilted dies can create coins where one side of the rim is noticeably taller or more defined than the opposite side, a characteristic that specialists document as part of die variety attribution. All of this examination is preliminary and educational. The final word on what any coin actually is and what it might reasonably be worth in the current market belongs to professional authenticators and experienced specialists who have spent careers developing the judgment that transforms careful observation into reliable conclusions. And the 1973 D. Kennedy $50, for all its apparent familiarity, is exactly the kind of coin that sometimes reveals something unexpected to the person willing to look closely enough and ask the right questions at the right time. Step 3. The 1974 Kennedy $50 arrived in American commerce during one of the most economically turbulent years the country had experienced since the Great Depression, and that broader context gives this coin a cultural weight that goes well beyond its face value or its metal composition. The United States in 1974 was absorbing the shock of the oil embargo's aftermath, watching inflation climb in ways that made everyday purchases feel uncertain, and processing the unprecedented resignation of a sitting president that summer. And through all of it, the mint kept running, pressing millions of $50 at Philadelphia and Denver, while San Francisco carefully produced proof versions for collectors who understood that even ordinary years in American coinage could eventually become extraordinary ones. The Kennedy $50 series had by this point settled into its post-silver identity completely. The 40% silver transitional era of 1965 through 1970, now several years behind it, and the clad composition of copper-nickel bonded over pure copper core had become simply what these coins were: utilitarian, durable, and in the eyes of most Americans who encountered them in change or cash draws, entirely unremarkable. That unremarkability is precisely the starting point for understanding why certain 1974 examples eventually attracted serious collector attention, because the coins that history overlooks in the moment are sometimes exactly the ones that reward patience and careful examination years and decades later. Gilroy Roberts' portrait of Kennedy on the obverse of this coin had been in production for a full decade by 1974, and there's something worth sitting with in that fact: 10 years of the same image being impressed into metal millions of times across multiple facilities, the working dies gradually wearing and being replaced, the hub maintaining the original artistic vision while the production machinery around it aged and evolved. The portrait captures Kennedy in left-facing profile with a composed, almost contemplative expression, the hairline above the temple rendered in careful relief, the strong jaw and the slight definition of the collar below the neck truncation all present in the original design, and preserved with varying degrees of fidelity depending on the quality of the individual strike. On a sharply struck 1974 example, the hair above Kennedy's ear separates into distinct strands visible under magnification. The cheekbone carries a subtle contour that reflects the sculptor's attention to anatomy, and the lettering of Liberty arching across the top of the coin shows clean, fully formed serifs on each character. Frank Gasparo's reverse eagle, that heraldic figure holding olive branch and arrows with the shield at its breast and the arc of stars above its head, achieves genuine visual complexity on well-struck pieces, the individual feathers along the wing edges showing separation and dimension, the banner inscription United States of America sitting in precise relationship to the design elements below it, the entire composition balanced in a way that rewards slow, attentive looking rather than the quick glance most people give a coin before spending it. Philadelphia and Denver both struck circulation examples of the 1974 Kennedy half-dollar, and San Francisco produced the proof versions, with each facility leaving behind a numismatic fingerprint that collectors have spent years learning to read. The Philadelphia coins carry no mint mark, that absence itself being a kind of identifier, while Denver pieces bear the D below Kennedy's portrait that has become so familiar to anyone who has studied American coinage of this era. Mintage figures for both circulation facilities ran into the tens of millions, numbers that create the same paradox experienced collectors recognize immediately. Enormous production volumes don't guarantee the survival of high-quality examples, because the same distribution systems that moved coins efficiently into commerce were indifferent to the kind of careful handling that preserves mint state surfaces. Coins traveling in canvas bags, being counted by machine, transferred between banks and registers and change drawers, accumulate the small abrasions and contact marks that grading services evaluate so precisely when assigning numerical grades. The 1974 D or Philadelphia issue that somehow avoided that accumulated damage, perhaps sitting in an original mint bag that was never opened, or set aside immediately by someone attentive enough to recognize fresh uncirculated coins when they saw them, represents a survival story as much as a numismatic specimen, a small piece of industrial history that made it through decades intact when the vast majority of its companions did not. The San Francisco proof coins of 1974 occupy their own distinct chapter within this date's collecting story, and they deserve careful separate consideration because the proof production process creates fundamentally different coins from the same general design. Proof planchets are specially prepared, burnished to a mirror finish before striking, and the dies used to strike them are polished to similarly reflective standards, creating the deeply mirrored fields and frosted design elements that define the cameo appearance so prized by proof collectors. A 1974 S-proof with strong cameo contrast, where Kennedy's portrait and the reverse eagle appear as frosted, almost matte finish elements floating against fields that reflect like still dark water, is a genuinely beautiful numismatic object, and examples that have been preserved in their original packaging without cleaning or mishandling can still display that contrast with remarkable freshness after 50 years. The grading designation of deep cameo or ultra cameo, assigned by professional services when the contrast meets their highest standards, represents a meaningful premium over standard proof examples of the same date, and collectors assembling registry sets or date-by-date proof collections actively compete for the finest certified examples of each San Francisco issue. Even within the proof series, individual coins vary in the depth of their mirrored fields and the intensity of the frosting on design elements, meaning that two coins with the same date and mint mark can represent very different collector propositions depending on what professional examination reveals about their specific characteristics. Mint variations on the 1974 Kennedy half-dollar extend beyond the expected mint mark differences and into territory that rewards systematic examination of individual coins rather than assumptions based on date and facility alone. The hand-punching of mint marks into working dies during this period introduced the possibility of repunched mint marks on Denver examples, where the punch was applied with slight positional differences between impressions, leaving traces of a secondary D that careful magnification can reveal adjacent to or overlapping the primary mint mark. Die varieties extending to the obverse lettering and portrait details are documented across the Kennedy series for multiple dates, and while the 1974 issue hasn't achieved the same level of widespread variety collector attention as certain other dates in the series, the foundational possibility of doubled die characteristics affecting the lettering or Kennedy's features exists whenever multiple hub impressions were applied to a working die. Strike quality variation across the production run means that coins from early die states, when the working dies were fresh and capable of transferring the full sharpness of the design, look meaningfully different under magnification from late die state examples, where accumulated wear on the die surfaces has softened the definition of fine details. These are not dramatic visual differences that announce themselves immediately, but they are real distinctions that specialists trained in this series can identify reliably, and that ability to identify them is the foundation of serious variety collecting. Discussing collector market values around the 1974 Kennedy half-dollar requires the kind of deliberate precision that separates responsible numismatic education from speculative enthusiasm, and that precision starts with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what most examples of this coin are actually worth in the current market. Circulated examples showing the expected wear patterns of coins that passed through decades of commerce, the softening of Kennedy's cheekbone and hair detail, the flattening of the eagle's highest relief areas on the reverse, the general smoothing of the rim, trade for modest amounts that reflect their genuinely common status, typically close to face value in casual transactions and only marginally above it in organized collector settings. The value conversation changes substantially when condition rises to uncirculated levels and professional certification confirms that assessment with specificity, because a 1974 Philadelphia or Denver half-dollar graded MS65 by PCGS or NGC, representing a coin with original cartwheel luster, above-average strike, and minimal contact marks, occupies a meaningfully different market position than its abundant mintage might suggest to someone unfamiliar with how condition rarity works in high mintage series. Certified examples in the MS66 and MS67 range, where the combination of exceptional strike, original surfaces, and near-perfect preservation becomes genuinely rare regardless of total mintage, have drawn prices from serious collectors that would surprise anyone who dismissed the 1974 issue as too common to be interesting. Figures in the hundreds of dollars for the finest certified examples. Sometimes more in competitive auction settings when registry collectors are actively pursuing a specific date to complete or upgrade a set. These are estimates based on historical auction records and are never guaranteed to represent future market performance. When verified mint errors enter the 1974 Kennedy half-dollar conversation, the entire value framework expands into territory that demands both excitement and careful qualification. Off-metal errors, coins struck on planchets intended for a different denomination or composition, represent some of the most dramatic and collectible anomalies in American coinage. And while they're genuine rarities rather than common occurrences, documented examples from this era prove that the mint's quality control processes were not perfectly infallible. A 1974 half-dollar struck on a quarter planchet, or on a cent planchet, or displaying a dramatic die cap or brockage error would be a coin that professional authenticators could verify through precise measurement, composition analysis, and visual characteristics that distinguish genuine errors from post-mint alterations. And authenticated examples of dramatic errors from this series and period have entered auction records at prices ranging from several $100s for modest errors in average condition to several $1,000s or more for dramatic, well-documented anomalies in exceptional preservation. The essential qualification attached to every sentence in that discussion is professional authentication, because the error coin market is sophisticated and experienced enough that unverified claims about unusual characteristics are treated with appropriate skepticism by serious buyers and reputable dealers alike. Understanding that a certified error coin and an uncertified one with similar visual characteristics represent fundamentally different collector propositions is practical knowledge that protects both buyers and sellers from misunderstandings that can be costly and frustrating for everyone involved. Examining a 1974 Kennedy half-dollar with the attention it deserves means approaching the coin as a document rather than a denomination, reading it for the information pressed into its surfaces rather than the purchasing power it represents. The edge examination comes first, that thin band of metal around the coin's circumference where the clad structure should be visible as a distinct copper layer sandwiched between the outer nickel-alloy surfaces, a structural characteristic that confirms correct composition before any other evaluation begins. Weight follows immediately, because the 11.34 gram standard for clad $half of this period is a precise specification that genuine examples should meet within tight tolerances, and deviation in either direction is an observation worth documenting and investigating further rather than dismissing. Under magnification, the mint mark on Denver examples warrants close scrutiny for any signs of repunching, while the obverse lettering in both Philadelphia and Denver coins should be examined for doubling or any offset impressions that might indicate a double die variety worth pursuing through specialized reference materials and ultimately professional attribution. The strike alignment across obverse and reverse deserves attention as well, because rotated die errors, where the reverse design sits at an angle relative to the obverse rather than the standard coin alignment, represent documented error types that authentication services can confirm and certify when the rotation is significant enough to be meaningful. All of this examination is the beginning of a process rather than a conclusion, and the responsible path from careful personal observation to any transaction involving a coin believed to be unusual runs directly through professional authentication services, whose expertise and reputation exist precisely to answer the questions that even the most attentive personal examination cannot definitively resolve on its own. Step 4. The 1981 Kennedy $half enters the story at a moment in American history that felt simultaneously exhausted and electric, a country emerging from the stagflation and hostage crises of the Carter years, stepping into the Reagan era with a mixture of cautious optimism and unresolved anxiety, and watching the mint continue its quiet industrial work of producing coins that most Americans would handle briefly and forget entirely. $half by 1981 had largely disappeared from everyday commerce in a practical sense, not because they were scarce in production terms, but because the denomination had gradually lost its role in routine transactions, displaced by the convenience of smaller coins and the growing preference for paper currency in situations where a $half might once have changed hands naturally. The United States Mint was still striking them in substantial numbers. Philadelphia and Denver both contributed to the circulation coinage, while San Francisco focused on proof production. But the coins were increasingly finding their way into rolls and bags that sat undisturbed in bank vaults rather than circulating actively through the economy. A distribution pattern that would have interesting consequences for the survival rate of high-quality examples that collectors would later search for with genuine dedication. There's a quiet irony in the idea that a coin produced in large numbers but rarely spent might actually survive in better average condition than heavily circulated issues from earlier decades. And understanding that irony is one of the first things that draws serious collectors into studying series like the Kennedy $half, with the kind of sustained attention that eventually reveals everything worth knowing. Kennedy's portrait on the 1981 obverse carries the same fundamental sculptural integrity that Gilroy Roberts established in 1964, but 17 years of die production, hub refinement, and accumulated mint experience had introduced subtle generational differences in how the design was being transferred and struck by this point in the series. The master hub, used to create working dies in 1981, was the product of multiple generations of reduction and reproduction from the original Galvano, and while the essential character of the portrait, the left-facing profile, the careful rendering of the hair, the composed presidential dignity of the expression, remained consistent with Roberts' original vision. Specialists who have studied the series across its full production history note that the crispness of certain fine details evolved over time in ways that reward comparison between early and later issues under magnification. On the best struck 1981 examples, Kennedy's hair above the temple still shows the individual strand definition that Roberts built into his original design. The jawline carries its characteristic clean relief, and the lettering of Liberty and the date below the portrait maintains the precise character spacing that the design specified. But on weaker strikes from worn dies, those same elements can feel compressed and slightly indistinct. The difference between a coin that was pressed with full intent and one that the machinery produced almost as an afterthought near the end of a die's useful life. Frank Gasparo's reverse eagle remains one of the more visually complex designs in modern American coinage, and the 1981 examples that preserve the full feather detail along the wing edges and the shield definition at the eagle's breast represent a meaningful step above the softly struck pieces that make up a larger portion of the production run than most people realize. The minting context of 1981 deserves careful attention because this particular year sits within a period when the mint was navigating significant operational and administrative transitions that had real consequences for the quality and consistency of coins being produced. The shift from hand-punched mint marks to mint marks incorporated directly into the master hub, a change that was being implemented progressively through this era, affected how the D and S designations appeared on coins of this period, and collectors who specialize in this transitional window have documented interesting variations in mint mark appearance and positioning across different issues of the early 1980s. The San Francisco proof coins of 1981 carry the S mint mark and were produced to the elevated technical standards that define the proof series, with specially prepared planchets and polished dies creating the mirrored field and frosted device contrast that proof collectors evaluate so carefully when grading individual examples. Within the 1981 S-proof production, there are documented varieties relating to the appearance of the S mint mark itself, with collectors distinguishing between what they describe as the Type 1 and Type 2 S mint mark configurations based on subtle differences in the shape and construction of the letter. A distinction that sounds almost impossibly minor until you understand that this is exactly the kind of detail that separates a common proof from a specifically sought variety that certain collectors will pursue with considerable patience and competitive bidding energy at the right auction. The survival story of the 1981 Kennedy $half in mint state condition is more complicated and interesting than the raw mintage numbers suggest at first consideration, because those numbers tell you how many coins were made, but nothing about how many reached collectors in genuinely pristine condition before the distribution process introduced its inevitable damage. Coins traveling through the Federal Reserve System in the early 1980s moved in heavy canvas bags that were machine-counted, mechanically sorted, and transferred multiple times between facilities before reaching individual banks. And each stage of that journey introduced opportunities for the kind of contact damage that professional graders document as bag marks, those small, flat abrasions most visible in the open field areas of a coin's surface that tell the story of a piece that was present for industrial-scale coin handling. A 1981 Philadelphia or Denver $half that somehow avoided that accumulated contact damage and arrived in a collector's hands with its original mint luster intact, that distinctive cartwheel sheen that flows across well-preserved surfaces when the coin is slowly rotated under a single light source, is genuinely uncommon relative to the total production. And the coins certified by grading services at the MS65 level and above represent a small fraction of the total issue that survived in condition worthy of that designation. The population reports published by PCGS and NGC, those databases tracking every coin they've certified by date, mint mark, and grade, reveal exactly how thin the upper end of the condition census can be for dates that most people assume are too common to bother examining carefully. Possible mint variations on the 1981 Kennedy $half extend across several categories that responsible collectors investigate systematically rather than assuming any particular example is either ordinary or extraordinary without looking carefully first. Doubled die varieties, where the working die received multiple impressions from the hub at slightly different positions and transferred that doubling to every coin it subsequently struck, have been documented across the Kennedy series for various dates, and the possibility exists for 1981 examples in both the circulation and proof series, even if dramatic doubled dies for this specific date haven't achieved the widespread collector fame of certain other years. Examining the obverse lettering, the date numerals, and Kennedy's portrait features under quality magnification for any signs of doubling, that slight shadow or offset impression sitting adjacent to the primary design element, is the starting point for this kind of investigation. And the reference materials assembled by variety specialists over decades of systematic study provide the comparison images needed to determine whether an observed anomaly matches a documented die variety or represents something that warrants professional attribution. Strike rotation errors, off-center strikes, and planchet anomalies represent additional variation categories that authenticated examples can fall into. And while none of these error types is common by definition, their existence across the broader landscape of American coinage from this period means that approaching a 1981 half-dollar with genuine investigative curiosity rather than automatic dismissal is always the more interesting and potentially rewarding choice. Collector market values for the 1981 Kennedy half-dollar require honest framing that respects both the genuine interest this date holds for specialists and the equally genuine reality that most examples are common coins worth modest amounts in typical collector transactions. Circulated 1981 Philadelphia or Denver half-dollar showing the expected wear of a coin that spent time in commerce, softened portrait detail, flattened eagle relief, smooth rim edges, is a genuinely abundant coin that most dealers would price at or near face value without strong reason to do otherwise. And anyone approaching a sale with inflated expectations based on age alone is likely to encounter a reality check that feels disappointing without the context to understand why. The value proposition changes meaningfully when condition rises to the mint state levels that professional certification confirms with precision, because a 1981 half-dollar graded MS66 or MS67 by PCGS or NGC represents a coin that cleared multiple evaluators' standards for exceptional strike, original surfaces, and minimal contact disturbance. A combination that becomes genuinely uncommon regardless of total mintage, and that serious registry collectors are willing to pay meaningfully above face value to acquire. Certified examples at those upper grade levels have appeared in auction records at prices ranging from modest premiums over common date values to several $100s for the finest certified specimens in competitive bidding environments, though these figures reflect specific market moments and specific collector demand patterns that are never guaranteed to repeat in any future transaction, a qualification that applies to every value discussion in numismatics without exception. When the 1981 S-proof varieties enter the value conversation, alongside the possibility of verified mint errors from any 1981 facility, the market dynamics shift in ways that reflect the heightened collector interest those specific categories attract. The Type 1 versus Type 2 S-mint mark distinction on 1981 proof Kennedy half-dollars is a documented variety that proof set specialists and Kennedy series collectors have discussed extensively in numismatic literature and online forums, and certified examples identified with the correct attribution command premiums over non-attributed proofs of the same date that reflect genuine collector demand rather than speculative enthusiasm. Though the actual premium depends entirely on current market conditions, the availability of competing examples, and the preferences of buyers active in the market at a given time, none of which can be predicted with certainty or reliability. Mint era coins from 1981, pieces authenticated as having been struck on wrong planchets, displaying dramatic die failures, or showing significant mechanical doubling distinct from the hub doubling of doubled die varieties, represent the upper end of what collectors might seek from this date, and professionally authenticated dramatic errors have historically drawn prices in ranges that reflect the genuine rarity of surviving documented examples. A 1981 half-dollar confirmed as struck on a cent planchet, or displaying a dramatic off-center strike where a substantial percentage of the design is missing from one side while the remaining design detail is sharply preserved, is not a coin most people will ever encounter, but it is a coin that exists within the documented record of American Mint-era coinage, and understanding its potential significance is part of approaching this series with the full seriousness it deserves. Examining a 1981 Kennedy half-dollar responsibly means bringing a specific set of investigative tools and habits to the coin before drawing any conclusions about its identity or significance. The edge of the coin is your first reference point. That thin band around the circumference should display the layered clad structure of a copper core visible between the outer nickel alloy surfaces, a structural characteristic that confirms correct composition immediately and establishes the baseline from which any further investigation proceeds. Weight comes next, measured on a digital scale precise enough to resolve tenths of a gram, with the 11.34 gram standard for clad half-dollars serving as the comparison point that any genuine example should meet within reasonable tolerances. Deviation in either direction is an observation that warrants further investigation rather than immediate conclusions. Under magnification, move systematically across the obverse, examining the S, D, or absent mint mark for any doubling or repunching, then studying Kennedy's portrait features and the surrounding lettering for any offset impressions that might indicate a double die worth documenting. Rim height and consistency around the full circumference of the coin reveals information about die alignment and strike pressure that experienced variety attributors use to distinguish between different die states of the same basic variety. All of this personal examination is preliminary and educational, the work of a curious and attentive collector building the observational foundation that makes professional consultation meaningful, because the final determination of what any coin actually is and what it might reasonably be worth in a market that values documented authenticity above all else belongs to the professional grading and authentication services whose expertise exists precisely to answer those questions with the authority that protects everyone involved in a transaction. If you've enjoyed exploring the hidden history and collecting potential within the 1981 Kennedy half-dollar, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next coin in this series. Each one carries its own remarkable story, its own production mysteries, and its own quiet potential waiting to be discovered by the collector willing to look closely enough.